The words to which I should like to call your attention this morning are to be found in Paul's epistle to the Ephesians in chapter 6, reading from verse 10 to verse 13. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. We are at the moment dealing in particular with that phrase about the wiles of the devil. Put on the whole armor of God that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. And here we are considering the manifestation of the wiles of the devil as they are shown in his attacks upon us as individuals. We've already been considering the wiles of the devil as they are manifested in big movements in the life of the church. We've seen certain great heresies in the past. We've looked at modern cults and things of that description. But now we are dealing with it in a more personal, a more immediate and direct manner. And we've seen that the devil tends to attack us as individuals in the realm of the mind and understanding, in the realm of the experience, and in the realm of practice and of conduct. And at the moment we're looking at his attacks upon us in the realm of our experience. Now, last Sunday morning we began this consideration by showing how the devil tends to confuse us with regard to the whole place of experience in our Christian faith, with regard to the whole of the experimental side. And he drives us from one extreme to the other. And we also looked at the place of feelings in connection with our faith and our Christian life, and saw how he can bring us into utter confusion there again. Now, there I've been reminding you of what is the great characteristic of the manifestation of the wiles of the devil in every department and in every realm, and whatever the method. It is the creation of confusion. If only he can get us into this state of confusion that we don't quite know where we are, well then, of course, he has succeeded completely with us. And the way in which he most customarily tries to do that is just this. He drives us from one extreme right over to the other. We saw that in the case of feelings. Some people make everything of feelings and are entirely subjective and live on their feelings. Others go to the other extreme and are more or less purely intellectualist, take an entirely objective view and are not concerned about their feelings at all and have never experienced anything. Well, now, thus you see, by driving us from one extreme to the other, he gets us into a state of confusion. In avoiding one danger, we jump into another danger. And to the devil, it is quite immaterial as to which extreme we're in, as long as we're in an extreme, and as long as we're in this state of confusion and of unhappiness. Well, now, as we proceed with this, these particular points will become very clear and manifest once more. He has a fundamental method, and were it not for this, we would be unable to preach a series of sermons like this, and we'd be unable to do anything about it. It's a most interesting thing, this. The devil is the great counterfeit, always, of God and his works. And there is one thing in common, and it is this fundamental plan and pattern. It's there in God's work, isn't it? God always works on a fundamental plan. You see it in nature, in creation. It's to be seen everywhere. There's a great fundamental plan. Variations, of course, in the application and operation, but an essential plan. Well, now it's exactly the same with the wiles of the devil. Oh, his particular use of this plan can vary so much that at times it's almost impossible to recognize it. But if you take the trouble, you'll always find that it's there. And as we go on, therefore, with another manifestation of the wiles of the devil, it is good and right that we should keep our eye on this fundamental plan. Now, I propose to consider with you this morning the wiles of the devil as they are to be seen in the confusion he creates as between the physical, the psychological, and the spiritual. Now then, here is an extraordinary subject. The wiles of the devil, I say, as they are revealed and manifested in confusion between the physical, psychological, and spiritual. Dear me, says someone, what's this got to do with me? Well, before I finished, I think you'll find that it's got a great deal to do with you. And if you don't realize that this is a subject which is perhaps one of the most practical that we can ever consider, it just means that you are the victim of the wiles of the devil in this very respect. Now, here, I say, is a realm in which the activities of the devil are perhaps most frequent and most damaging. And this is the case very largely because it's a very difficult subject, and that gives the devil his opportunity. We all know that we're strange creatures. We're made up of body, mind, and spirit. And all these are interrelated and react upon one another. And so many of our troubles in life are due to that fact, and our failure to realize the place and the function and the sphere of each one of these realms, and the confusion. And the devil, of course, takes full advantage of this, and thus he attacks Christian people. Now, let me make it clear that I'm dealing only with Christian people. In dealing with the works of the devil in general many months ago, we looked at his activity with respect to all people. But now, in dealing with the wiles of the devil, we are, of course, in particular dealing with Christian people. It is only to them that the exhortation comes to put on the whole armor of God. If a man isn't a Christian, he doesn't know what the whole armor of God is. He's not even interested in it. We're not concerned about him. We are concerned about the failure and the trouble in the life of Christian people as the result of the wiles of the devil in this particular respect. Now, the difficulty arises in many ways just here, that it is extremely difficult to define the limits of these realms. Or, if I may put it in another way, the difficulty arises because of borderline cases. There are certain obvious cases, but the difficulty arises with the borderline cases, which are not quite so easy to classify. And therefore, this is a subject which has been very largely neglected for that reason, and there isn't very much help available. Now, here to me is a very interesting point. If you want books that will really help you on this particular matter, you will find that you are compelled to read either a certain type of Roman Catholic literature or else Puritan literature. Practically nobody else has touched this at all. Now, I say Roman Catholic literature, what do I mean? Well, I mean this, that you will find that they have many manuals of the devout life, as they call them, sometimes in the form of the life of one of their so-called saints, St. Bernard, St. Francis de Sales, Catherine, and many others. Now, they had developed a great system with regard to this. They were interested in the experimental aspect, the so-called mystical side of the Christian faith. And they were aware of many of these problems. The very fact that they have what they call the confessional is indicative of this. They saw that people were in trouble, that the devil had got them into a kind of tangle out of which they couldn't extricate themselves, and that it was necessary, therefore, that they should be given some help and some aid. So they began to produce these manuals of the devout life, or these helps and these aids, which assist us in disentangling ourselves and seeing the various things that can happen to us. They've got literature along that line. And then I say the other class of literature is that which is commonly known as Puritan. The Puritans of 300 years ago were real experts in this matter. They were primarily pastors and interested in the pastoral side. And as you read their great works, their voluminous works, you will find that the vast majority of them are concerned to unravel the problems and the difficulties of Christian life and living. And they were masters in it. You can put them not only up against the Roman Catholic writers, you have to say, if you've studied both, that they're altogether superior because they're more biblical and more scriptural. I'm thinking of the men now, for instance, not only the great theological writers like Dr. John Owen and so on. This is exactly what John Bunyan was doing. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and his Grace Abounding, History of Man's Soul, and all these books, they're really just concerned to do this very thing. He was aware in his own experience and in his knowledge of the experience of others that the wiles of the devil are continually being manifested with regard to the believer. So there he is in prison for 12 years in Bedford, and he makes use of his time in writing these great works in that allegorical form to help Christian people to do the very thing we're exhorted to do here, to put on the whole armor of God that we may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. And he does it in that way of his. He personalizes these particular problems, puts them in the name of Mr. So-and-so, Mr. Greatheart, Mr. Standfast, Mr. Fearful, and so on. It's nothing but a very profound analysis of the wiles of the devil. But what is interesting to observe is that from about the end of the 17th century, roughly, this matter has been sadly neglected. Now, I think I can explain that. During the 18th and most of the 19th centuries, of course, they had available the Puritan writings. They were constantly being reprinted, and the people read them, so that there was no need, in a sense, for fresh literature. But from about the middle of the last century onwards, that has not been the explanation. These great writings have not been reprinted as they had been formerly. People no longer read them. What's happened? Well, a lighter and a superficial view has come in of evangelism and of sanctification and of the whole of the Christian life, which doesn't even recognize the problem. And the result is that this most vital and central aspect of our Christian experience has scarcely been written about at all, has practically not been touched. It is to me a most significant fact. In other words, I'm suggesting once more that the condition of the church is what it is today, and I'm including the evangelical section, very largely because of ignorance of the wiles of the devil. A patent remedy type of evangelism and teaching of sanctification, which is not scriptural and has not even begun to realize the nature of the life in which we are and the strength and the power and the subtlety of the enemy that is set against us. Very well. Here, then, you see, is a very large and a very subtle matter. Now, it is because of this that not only does preaching become necessary, but pastoral work becomes necessary also. And this is a great part of the work of the pastor. It hasn't been realized, as I say, as it should be. But this is where the pastor and the teacher come in, and indeed where we all come in and should be able to help one another. Now, it is because of ignorance about this subject that so much damage is done to individual souls. I wish I'd kept a record of these matters. So often have people come to me in trouble, and they've told me the story. And it's been something like this. They got into one of these difficulties as the result of the wiles of the devil, and they went to some well-known Christian leader in their particular circle or realm. And far from being helped, they were made to feel much worse, because after stating their case and their story, all that was done was that they were told by some bouncing type of Christian leader to pull themselves together, to shake themselves, not to give in to this sort of thing. In other words, the Christian leader who was consulted knew nothing about the wiles of the devil, didn't begin to understand. You noticed, I take it, the interesting point in that last hymn of William Cowper's which we sang. Did you notice how they put that star opposite that one particular verse, by which they mean that you can omit it if you want to? But you notice the one that they suggested we might omit. What peaceful hours I once enjoyed, how sweet their memory still, but they have left an aching void the world can never fill. Why did they say we may leave that out? Well, I take it that the editors of the book just didn't know what he was talking about. They don't recognize this possibility. And there are many Christian people like that. In their utter ignorance of this realm where the borderlines of the physical, psychological, and spiritual meet, because they're so utterly ignorant of the whole thing, they're not only not able to help, they do great harm. Or very often I found this, that they have treated people whose trouble was obviously mainly physical or psychological in a spiritual manner. And if you do that, of course, you not only don't help, you aggravate the whole condition. Very well. There is nothing more important than that we should look into this subtle, difficult, and involved matter together. All I can do is to give some great headings and principles. Now, let me show you what I mean. The first is this. Let's look at the mistake of regarding the physical or psychological as spiritual. Now, here's a great cause of confusion. What do I mean? Well, let me take them one by one. Sometimes Christian people are in great trouble because they mistake what is nothing but a purely physical condition for a spiritual condition. Remember, we are body, soul, and spirit. Each one of us is that. Now then, there are people in trouble because they mistake what is purely physical for the spiritual. This is the kind of thing I mean. This Christian may be taken ill with some diseased condition, may not even be aware of that. All that he or she knows is that they don't feel as they used to feel. Kind of lethargy overtakes them, don't enjoy reading the Bible as they used to, can't pray as they used to. They're in a kind of depressed condition. And they can't understand this, and the devil comes to them and suggests, of course, that it's because they're slipping in a spiritual sense, perhaps even raises the question as to whether they've ever been spiritual at all, and thus torments them and worries them and agitates them. They're not able to concentrate as they were formerly, and they feel they can't be as active as they used to feel. Now then, the devil comes in, you see, and suggests that this is a purely spiritual problem, that there's something gone wrong, that God is somehow displeased with them, and that they're being punished, and so on. And so they find themselves in an agony of soul. Now, I could illustrate this matter to you almost endlessly. Let me give you one example. I remember on one occasion, it must be some 20 years ago, receiving a letter from a lady in a certain district. It must be 25 years ago, I recollect, asking if I'd be good enough to try to help her to listen to her story. And this is what she told me. She told me that she'd been experiencing the kind of thing I'm describing, this kind of lethargy, interest not as great as it was, inability to do things, and she was in a spiritual agony, feeling that things had gone wrong spiritually. Well, she had heard of a certain well-known preacher who claimed to be an expert in matters psychological and spiritual. And she had written to him. And he, for many months, had been treating her by means of correspondence. But the poor lady, far from getting better, was getting worse and was in a spiritual agony. Well, now, it's very difficult to report these things without sounding egotistical and boastful, but I'm simply trying to illustrate the theme that I'm holding before you. I had to take but one glance at this good lady to see that she was suffering from a disease known as pernicious anemia. And as the result of her anemia, of course, she was losing her energy, losing her power of concentration, Everything was being lowered. You can't have anemia, pernicious anemia, and still feel bright and energetic and keen and enthusiastic. And you see, if you go to try to help a poor Christian who's suffering from pernicious anemia and not being treated for it by just telling her to pull herself together and not to give in, not only are you not helping her, you're being cruel to her. You're aggravating the problem, as it had been aggravated in the case of that particular lady. And all she needed was, of course, the recognized treatment for pernicious anemia, and she made a complete recovery and recovered in every sense. But there, you see, is an example of a confusion as between the physical and the spiritual, regarding something that is essentially a physical condition and problem as spiritual. It's our ignorance that does it, but the devil takes advantage. All we know is that we are not as we once were in our spiritual life, and he makes us think it's a purely spiritual problem, but sometimes it's a purely physical problem. Or let me give you other examples. This can happen, you know, purely as the result of overwork and overtiredness. How often have I met this? You see, the poor man doesn't realize he's doing too much. He's in a profession, he's in a business. But as a Christian, he feels he should be doing a lot of active work. So when he finishes his business or his professional work, he's got an engagement every night of the week and doesn't get home until a late hour, been doing Christian work. And then, of course, he's got certain work which he has to take home from the office. And he does this after he gets home in a tired condition. And he's been doing this for months, perhaps for years. But now the first thing he becomes aware of is he doesn't enjoy reading his scripture as he used to. He doesn't pray as he used to. Can't think as he used to. Seems to be losing interest. And the devil comes in at once and attacks him on the spiritual level. What he does, of course, immediately now is to do still more. He's determined to show that he's not slipping spiritually. So he adds to his burden, and on and on and on it goes. Many a time have I found myself in this position, that such a man or a woman has come to me, talking in a purely spiritual manner, outlining this spiritual problem in an agony of soul by now. And I, seeming to be very carnal and materialistic in my outlook, have just advised them to go for a holiday and to take a rest, and when they come back, to try to use a little common sense, to realize that there is a limit to what any one body can stand, that the nervous system mustn't be overstretched perpetually. It can't stand up to the strain. Now, this is something which is purely physical. But the devil, you see, presents it as a purely spiritual problem. And so the soul is in an agony and in a torment, imagining that the problem is purely spiritual, when I am suggesting it is, in a sense, not spiritual at all. Indeed, the only spiritual element that comes in is this, that a man hasn't understood as he should have done, that he has a body and that he is to respect it and not to abuse it. Very well. Now, the same thing applies, of course, to old age. Many Christians get into trouble along that line as they get older, and their faculties naturally and inevitably begin to fail. This, I'm not as I once was. I seem to be losing something. I'm slipping. Well, of course, it may be spiritual. All I'm suggesting under this heading is that sometimes it is purely physical. And we must be very careful, therefore, lest we condemn one another unfairly, and lest we do great harm to one another in our ignorance. Very well, then. There is my first example. And therefore it behoves us all to try to realize this possibility, to examine ourselves along this line, and to draw various distinctions. We need the help of others very often in this respect. But it is important that as Christians, we should realize that we are still in the body, and that we carry the body with us, and that the interactions of these various parts are very intimate and very important. Try to get hold of the main idea, and I think it will help you very largely to solve what is a very difficult problem. But come to the second example. The mistaking of the psychological for the spiritual. And under this heading of psychological, I'm including temperament, natural makeup, and things of that kind. Now, there are different types and kinds of personality to be had. We are not all the same, and we're not meant to be the same. But there are many people who don't realize that. And they fall into the error of thinking that the moment you become a Christian, you're identical with everybody else. This is one of the most fruitful fields for the manifestation of the wiles of the devil. Very well, then, how do we approach it? Well, we approach it like this. We must realize that we all have different types of personality, that is as God has made us. And secondly, we have to realize that when we are converted, when we are born again, our temperament remains exactly what it was before. A man's temperament is not changed when he is converted. Now, this is one of these fundamental points. If you imagine that when a man is born again, and you quote the text which says, if any man be in Christ Jesus, he's a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things become new. Very well, that means then that every Christian is identical with every other Christian. No difference at all. But of course, that is completely and entirely wrong. The fundamental type of personality and of temperament is not changed by conversion and by the rebirth. The new man means the new faculty, the new understanding, the new orientation. But the man himself, essentially physically, is still what he was before. Now, I want to illustrate this to you. There are some people, therefore, who by birth and by nature, by temperament, are naturally the depressed type. There are some people who are mercurial, there are some who are phlegmatic, there are some who are lively and animated, some are very slow. You're aware of these differences. You get these differences between nations, you get the differences in the nation. These tremendous varieties and variations. That's what I mean by the fundamental temperament or personality of the person. Now, this is just a fact that there are some people, therefore, who are born with this slightly depressed and melancholic type of temperament. I came across a very interesting statement about this only the week before last, and I want to read it to you. It was, strangely enough, in a letter written by William Cowper, the poet, whose hymn we've just been singing. It was written by Cowper to John Newton about a man of the name of the Reverend William Bull, who was for many years a congregational minister in Newport Pagnell. And of course, Cowper, living at Olney, became a great friend of the Reverend William Bull. Soon after they met, Cowper wrote to John Newton about Bull, and this is what he said. He said that he was a man who had got a most marvelous imagination. And when his imagination ran with him, his conversation was most scintillating and brilliant and interesting and entertaining. But he said, on the other hand, he seems to have a natural kind of melancholy about him, which makes him very attractive. And then Cowper goes on to philosophize and says this. He says that every scene in life has two sides, a dark and a light and a bright one. And then this is his statement. The mind that has an equal mixture of melancholy and vivacity is best of all qualified for the contemplation of life. Now, that's, to me, a most important and significant statement. Every scene in life has the two sides. There's a darker side and a bright one. Therefore, the best type of individual, says William Cowper, is the man who has that sort of mind, which is an equal mixture of melancholy and vivacity. Not only vivacity, not only melancholy, but a man who has a little of both. Well, now, the Reverend William Bull, you see, had a little of each of these. And as you read the biography of that man, as I've been doing recently, it's very interesting to see how this melancholic side takes charge now and again. And poor William Bull was in great trouble about the condition of his soul and of his spirit. He didn't realize what was true about himself. Cowper, looking on at him, could see it in Bull, but as I'm going to show you in a moment, couldn't see it in himself. and thus both became the victims of the wiles of the devil and found themselves in trouble. Why? Well, because William Bull didn't realize the truth about his own temperament. And because he didn't realize that, he attributed what was purely temperamental at times to that which is spiritual. Now, I don't hesitate to assert that this was probably the greatest problem of all that the mighty Apostle Paul ever had to face. Because there is no question at all that he conforms to this description of the highest type of personality and character as defined by William Cowper. Look at the vivacity. Look at the enthusiasm. Look at the zeal. Look at the eloquence. Look how he gets carried away. But then those passages that I read at the beginning, 2 Corinthians 7 and 2 Corinthians 12, indicate very clearly that he was often tempted by depression. Without were fightings, within were fears. Sensitive men, highly strung men, a man who could be depressed. The more I love you, he says, the more you cease to love me. Did you notice how he said that? He was hurt by these Corinthians, demanding, expecting love of them, not always getting it, and depressed when he didn't get it. Well, now, here is the man, you see, by nature and by temperament, this great and mighty apostle. His temperament hadn't changed. You remember that as persecutor of the church, he was violent. He beat everybody at that. Paul was always on top in every department. As a student at the feet of Gamaliel, he was always head of the list. He says that as regards the details of the law, surpassing all my contemporaries and all my countrymen, in zeal persecuting the church beyond everybody. And then when he became an apostle, well, the same thing came out. He didn't become suddenly a quiet preacher. No. He preached with all the intensity of his great and mighty emotional nature. He weeps, he tells us. And here he is within fears and concerned. The man's temperament is exactly what it was. The zeal with which he persecuted is the same zeal with which he preaches. The temperament remains a constant. But it's very difficult at times to remember this. And so when, for some reason or another, perhaps it may be partly physical again, and perhaps it may be overwork again, the vivacious side tones down and the melancholic side tends to come up. And here we are in this condition, and we imagine that we are in a very serious and sad spiritual condition. Now then, what are we to do about this? Well, we've just got to recognize the fact. We've got to get to know ourselves. Because if you don't know yourself, the devil will very soon get you into trouble along this line. You've got to know your temperament. You've got to know the sort of person you are. And realizing that, you've always got to be on guard. You've got to watch. We'll get that in detail when we're discussing the armor. But here it is at this particular point. You've got to observe that there are these differences, though they're all interrelated. And therefore you've got to recognize that the devil is always ready to attack you at that point and in that particular way. And therefore, and this is to me the important rule, you have to realize that as a Christian, though you still have got the same temperament that you always have had, as a Christian you must not become its victim. Now, the natural man is the victim of his temperament. That's why he's difficult to live with so often. He can't control his temper. That's his nature. He forgives in a moment, he says, yes, but he doesn't realize the damage is done by the things he said in his temper. The natural man is the victim of his temperament. His temperament controls him. The Christian's temperament is not changed, but he can control his temperament and should control his temperament and must control his temperament. He recognizes that it's there, and then because he does that, he watches it. He's on guard against it. He doesn't let the devil come in and make him think that this is a purely spiritual problem. So you mustn't be a victim of your temperament. And you must be careful of the wiles of the devil at this particular point. We can go one step further under this heading. I don't want to stay with it, but you see, sometimes it isn't merely a matter of temperament. It becomes actually a matter of psychological disease. William Cowper is perhaps the classical instance of this. He was a man who was subjected to and suffered from periodic attacks of melancholy, a psychological disease condition, but he didn't know it. Look at that hymn we've just been singing, Poor Cowper. You see, he thinks he's in spiritual trouble. He's in an agony of soul. He felt at times God had deserted him. It was entirely due to this diseased condition of his mind. There have been many others. There was a great Puritan in the United States 300 years ago called Thomas Shepard. He undoubtedly suffered from the same thing. He didn't know it. And he used to lash himself about his spiritual condition, when it's quite clear that the poor man was suffering one of these periodic attacks which came. Well, now, I don't want to stay with this, because at that point you need some expert help, probably. At any rate, you need the help of somebody who understands a little about all this, a pastor or somebody else. It may be purely medical. All I'm saying is this, that it is important to draw these distinctions, to recognize them, and to make sure that you're not allowing the devil to get you into an agony on your spiritual condition, when it can be explained adequately in terms of the physical or else the psychological. But let me go to a second big heading. If there are some who are in trouble because they mistake the physical and the psychological for the spiritual, there are others who do the exact opposite. They mistake the spiritual for the physical or the psychological. It's the exact reverse of the group with which we've already been dealing. Here is something which unfortunately is becoming more and more common in Christian circles. I'm dealing now with a tendency to evade spiritual problems by explaining them away in terms of the psychological or the purely physical. Indeed, I'm not sure that this isn't becoming the major problem in the life of the church. And what amazes me is that it's become true in the evangelical section of the church. There's been a great vogue for psychology and psychiatry amongst evangelical people in the last 20 years. Articles have appeared in certain of the religious periodicals, and everybody's thinking along this line. Let me illustrate it by telling you a story. One Sunday night, I went out of this pulpit about 15 years ago, and a young man came in to see me, looking very agitated and distressed. I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I wonder whether you can help me." I said, "What's your trouble?" He said, "Well, can you recommend to me a Christian psychologist?" I said, "Why do you need to see a psychologist?" And he told me his story. This young man had been a baker in the west of England. A man had been there on a 10-day mission. And this young man, having a good voice, had become the soloist in the mission. At the end of the mission, the evangelist had turned to him and said, "Have you ever thought of going in for whole-time work? You've got a gift, you know." "But I can't speak," said the man. "Oh," he said, "you only need a little bit of training. With that voice of yours, you'll make a fine evangelist." So he told him that he could have training. He said, "There's a college recently opened to train evangelists." He said, "I strongly recommend you to go there." So the young man came and began attending the college. He said, "I discovered in the first week that I could never do it." He said, "I couldn't follow the lectures. I'd never been taught how to take notes." He said, "I left school at a very early age. I really couldn't." I felt, however, he thought, I mustn't give in, and I persisted. But by the second week, he said, I was quite certain that it was all wrong, that I was making a big mistake, that I'd never be able to learn and pass the examinations and become an evangelist. So, he said, I went to see the principal of the college, and I told him all this and felt that I'd like to resign and go back to my work. And he said, the first thing he said to me was this: "You need to see a psychologist." So the young man had come to see me wanting to know if I could recommend to him a Christian psychologist. Well, I need scarcely say that my reply to the young man was this. I said, "My dear friend, you don't need to see a psychologist now. If ever you needed to see one," I said, "it was when you went to the college. But by now," I said, "you've come to yourself. You don't need a psychologist. Go back to your work and go on bearing your Christian witness and testimony as you've been doing in the past. But you see, you need to see a psychologist. Why? Here's a young man who doesn't seem to be balanced. He can't balance things." The man couldn't see that the young man had been given the wrong advice at the beginning. There was no psychological problem at all. This is a pure matter of spiritual understanding and indeed common sense. He should never have been taken out of his baking. That's his work, that's his realm, and he can be a wonderful Christian as a baker. Back the young man went, and of course, immediately got rid of all his troubles. But this is becoming very common. People come and say, I'd like to see a psychologist, can you recommend someone? Whereas the whole time the problem is a purely spiritual. They come and say, but you know, I'm beginning to think I belong to such and such a type. They've got this smattering of psychology and this terminology. Now let me try and summarize it by putting it in this way. Very often, the trouble with these people is that they've never been Christians at all. They've never been converted. They think they have, they've taken a decision, and they've been told they're Christians. But they're in trouble, and a little conversation reveals that they've really never been Christians at all. They were either pressed to a decision, or they had some emotional experience and thought they were Christians. They've regarded themselves as Christians, but they've never been Christians. But you see, the good people trying to help them have regarded them as Christians and have talked to them solely about sanctification, whereas they should have been talking to them about justification. If you talk to a man who needs to know the way of justification only in terms of sanctification, you'll aggravate his troubles. You'll make his problem much greater, and he'll be in unutterable confusion. Make certain that these people are Christians at all. Make certain they've got a foundation, because if there isn't a foundation, you can't build them. Secondly, very often you'll find that if they are Christians, that their real trouble is that they've got a very incomplete understanding of the truth. They've had an experience, yes, but they haven't been taught much. They've remained where they were as babes in Christ, and inevitably they get into trouble. It's a sheer lack of knowledge and of information. They need instruction. So don't send them to the psychologist. Teach them the doctrines of the Bible. And you will find in a most amazing manner that what appeared at first sight to be a great psychological problem just vanishes and disappears. Instruction in the way of righteousness, a grasp of the plan of salvation, an understanding of the doctrines gives them complete deliverance. They've been turning in themselves in this purely subjective, unhealthy state, always looking in and analyzing, and all they need is to see the great truth. Here's a third heading. Sometimes the trouble is due entirely and only to a lack of self-discipline. I've had Christian people who've come to me and said, I need to see a psychologist. Can you recommend a Christian one? I say, what's your trouble? Temper, they say. Can't control my temper. And you see what's happening? The devil says, the trouble with you is you're a psychological case. You must go and have psychological treatment. The problem, of course, is a purely spiritual, and I'm talking about Christians. And when I'm asked such a question, I say, no, I recommend no Christian psychologist to you. Well, what you tell me to do? I say, control your temper. But it's very difficult. Of course it's difficult, I say. Haven't we all got our difficulties? You see, you get out of it by saying I'm psychological. Of course, I'm not just an ordinary person with a bad temper. I'm a psychological case. I must go and in the meantime, the devil is rejoicing. You've regarded what is a purely spiritual problem as if it were psychological. My friend, you've no right to lose your temper as a Christian. These New Testament epistles tell you not to do so. Control yourself. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Control your tongue. What a practical book the New Testament is. No, you needn't rush off to the latest psychologist or to the latest vogue. Read your New Testament. Discipline, control yours. People come about other sins in exactly the same way. They say, I must be a psychological case. I'm always falling to that sin. This temptation makes me tremble. Do you think I need some psychological help? The Bible deals with it all. No, you don't. What you need is to fight the good fight of faith in this way, in a spiritual manner. Thus, you see, there is this whole tendency coming in at the present time, and that's my next heading, to explain away sin altogether in terms of psychology. The Wolfenden Report was doing that. These people, we are told, are psychological cases, and you must regard them as such. And there's what they call today diminished responsibility. Everything's being explained away in terms of diseased conditions or psychological states. I thank God for some evidence this week that the authorities are at last beginning to wake up again and to see that they've got to face this problem, that sin is sin and must be regarded as such. You can't explain away sin and disobedience in these other terms. It's a terrible and a horrible danger. And then my last heading is this: a failure to apply the truth and to reason things out. The failure to relate truth to our every condition. I see my time has gone, but let me just conclude by giving you one illustration of what I mean. I remember a person who came to me because she said she had got a horror and a phobia of thunder and lightning. She'd suffered from it for 23 years. But now the thing had become acute for this reason, that she practically never attended a place of worship, and for this reason. She'd set out from her home, she'd suddenly see a cloud. She'd begin to think it was going to develop. It would soon become a thundercloud. There'd be a storm, thunder and lightning. She was so frightened that she might give way in the chapel that she went home, so as not to disgrace the Christian cause. And she'd been treated psychologically for it. She'd been given all sorts and kinds of advice and had prayed about it to be delivered from it for years. It seemed to me that it was all wrong and that there was only one thing for this lady to do. It was this, was to realize that she was a child of God. That she was no more and no less a child of God than all the other Christians whom she knew. Why should she be so concerned about her life and her possible death in a thunderstorm than anybody else? If she were struck by lightning, would she cease to be a child of God? I just tried to tell her to think not about thunder and lightning, but about God as her Father, about God's care for her, for His children, and that she was disgracing God, and that what she must seek was not to be delivered so much from this particular fear. She must seek to be a good Christian, a noble disciple, to be worthy of God in every way. She must stop thinking about thunder and lightning. She must stop thinking psychologically. She must think in a purely spiritual manner. Now, that's just one illustration. Whatever it is that troubles you, and there are many things that trouble many people. Some people suffer from claustrophobia, others from agoraphobia. There are all sorts and kinds. Other people are frightened by storms, the gale, and so on. And the devil will try to get you to think that this is a purely psychological matter and you need psychological treatment. Resist him, steadfast in the faith. Put on the whole armor of God. Say no. Say, I'm a child of God. And whatever happens to me, I'm in God's hands, and God will allow no harm to come to me ultimately. He has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. I cannot give way to this. I'm not going to fall back on this other kind of aid. I believe in the living God who is my Father in Christ Jesus. You've got to apply your faith. You've got to face this thing and see it's the devil and resist it, standing on your faith and applying the truth. I close by giving you two marvelous quotations illustrating this. The first is in the book of Ezra, chapter 8, verse 22. Ezra and his people got to a very difficult point in their journey, and they didn't know what to do, and they were on the verge of asking the king for some help. Suddenly Ezra says, no, we can't do that, for I was ashamed to require of the king a band of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy in the way, because we had spoken to the king, saying, the hand of our God is upon all them for good that seek him. You see, when he'd set out in the journey, he'd said to the king said, you're doing a very hazardous thing, you know, there are enemies. They said, it's all right. The hand of our God is upon all them for good that seek him. We can't go back on that, said Ezra. It's a terrible position and it's very alarming. But if we go back and ask the king for a band of troops to protect us, why, we're letting God down. We've said God's protecting his people. We can't go back. We can't do that. So they held a fast and they went on and all was well. Do you know Nehemiah, in the next book in the Bible, had to do exactly the same thing? Read Nehemiah 6:11. The position was urgent. It was acute. The enemies were surrounding them. And a false friend came to Nehemiah and said, "You and I had better go and hide in the temple. Then we'll be safe there." And Nehemiah gave this immortal answer: "Should such a man as I flee?" That's it. "Should such a man as I flee? And who is there that, being as I am, would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in." Now that's the whole answer. Should such a man as I flee? A man of God, a child of God? Am I going to escape into the temple to save my life? Not a bit of it. I prefer to die in open battle, that God may be glorified in and through me. It's inconceivable. A man such as I must never flee. And I would apply that, my friend. I don't care what particular form the enemy is attacking you in this morning. Don't you flee to the psychologist. You're a Christian man. God can deal with these problems. Don't you explain away spiritual problems in terms of the psychological or the physical only. You see, the two extremes are wrong, the first group and this group. And the devil comes along all lines. But above all, I say, remember this: should such a man as I give in to this or that or the other? In other words, realize the truth about yourself. Take unto you the whole armor of God, this glorious doctrine. It's true of you. Doesn't matter what comes to meet you. Fight as a Christian. Stand as a man, having done all things to stand. Such a man as I. Say that to yourself, and you'll find your problems will soon be solved, and you needn't escape in any one or other of these various directions that the devil in his subtlety and in his wiles will be so ready to suggest to you. Thank God, I say once more, that we can be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Thank God for the word, the understanding, the instruction, the enlightenment, the knowledge. Get hold of it. Apply it. Practice it in every realm and department of your life. And the wiles of the devil will not be able to confound you. Amen.